Historical Society. Thank you for coming out during the election season. I know it's been particularly challenging tonight. So we have the diehards with us. We appreciate that. I have just a few announcements before we get started. The most important, of course, is our restroom. So you may have noticed that our normal restroom is under construction still. I believe that last month I thought it would be all done by now. So if you need the facility, there is a rustic one out through the archives. Do not be deterred by the sign that says, "Do not close this door."
Or do not use.
Feel free to close the door. That was just there so our pipes wouldn't freeze. We have a big announcement coming up, well, big for us. We have Margaritas fundraiser coming up on Tuesday, February 16th. So Pam may have put one of these in your hands as you walked in. If you take this in and present it to your server anytime on February 16th, the Historical Society gets 20% of your bill. So we would love, if you have a hankering for Mexican food, if you would stop into Margaritas on February 16th and present one of these. So you can take one tonight. We will also have them available on our website to print out, and we will have them, I believe, at Margaritas that night. So we would appreciate your support if you can make it work for you. And then I also just want to mention our next meeting is another New Hampshire Humanities program. New Hampshire's one-room rural schools, the romance and the reality. And that's by Steve Taylor, who's actually one of the founders of the New Hampshire Humanities Council. So we hope you can make that. So once again, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to Greg Gilman.
Did you want to kill the lights, or do you want to leave them on?
I think we'll kill them if that's
okay. That's fine. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Greg Gilman. I live in Exeter. I grew up in Exeter. And I'm a descendant of Gilmans who came to Exeter in the 1600s. And when I was invited to do a presentation tonight, I was thinking, what do I want to do a presentation on? They asked me to talk about the Gilmans in Exeter. And I was actually more drawn towards talking about genealogy as a historical process and linking it to the Gilmans as an example, a particular branch of the Gilmans in my family. So I want people to think tonight about what genealogy really is before we get into talking about the Gilmans. I mean, most people think of it as descent from certain ancestors. They associate it with sort of the collection of a pile of names and dates. This is my Gilman line, going back from me down at the bottom, Gregory Gilman, as far back as we can get, which is Edward Gilman and Rose Riss, who were married in the 1500s in England. Think about it. When you're going back in time that far, that many generations, each generation, there are twice as many ancestors. So if you see the little one down here, each time you go back a generation, it doubles. And of course we know this, but people lose the concept of what that really means the further back in time you go. So by the time you get to the generation of Edward Gilman and Rose Riss, just 13 generations ago, there are actually almost 8,200 ancestors in that particular generation. So many people lose sight of what it actually means. To give you a visual view of this, this is an 11-generation family tree chart. 2048 in that generation up at the top here. For those of you who think more visually. So we're going 13 generations back to Edward Gilman and Rose Riss. So if you think about that, what that means is that those two ancestors represent only 0.024% of the entire genetic makeup of an individual who's descended from them. And yet, many genealogists, certainly amateur genealogists, but many genealogists somehow seem to assign special significance to a specific person like that, particularly if they share the surname. I really don't look at genealogy that way. I try to find as many ancestors as I can in every different direction. I just wanted to make that point early in this presentation. This is a concept that one author called the mountain of names. If you assume an average generation length of 25 years and double the number of ancestors each generation, you'd have approximately 281 trillion forebears in that particular generation alive at the time of Charlemagne. I mean, that's kind of crazy. It's a big number. In fact, there were only about 220 million people that lived on the entire planet at that time. So clearly, there's something going on here, which is known as pedigree collapse, which is the result of cousins marrying cousins over time. If you think about the family tree, most people think about it as the bottom part of this rhombus. You know, it's a point in time, a single individual, and it goes back and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But what really happens is, if you get back far enough, there's so much duplication in the tree that ultimately it starts to collapse back in on itself. And it happens relatively soon. It only takes several centuries to get back to that. To quote Kenneth Wachter, who was a British demographer in the middle of the 20th century, if you were an English child born in 1947, you'd have 60,000 ancestors when America was first discovered, and 95% of them would be different people, which is sort of what the average person who's involved in genealogy thinks about. But by the time you get back to the Black Death, 30% of England's population would be among your ancestors. By the time you get back to King John, 80% of England would be among your ancestry. Think about that. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? So really, the further back you get, your family tree encompasses entire regions. And people should think about it that way. To put it a different way, Henry Adams, of course, one of our most famous historians in America, if we could go back and live again in all of our 250 million arithmetical ancestors of the 11th century, we should find ourselves doing many surprising things, but among the rest, we should certainly be plowing most of the fields of the Cotentin and Calvados, going to Mass in every parish church in Normandy, rendering military service to every lord, spiritual or temporal, in all this region, and helping to build the Abbey Church at Mont Saint-Michel. Really fascinating if you think about it, because we so identify with a particular line because it has a particular name or it's in a particular place. So it raises a question, you know, what's the point of genealogy? I'm really big into genealogy, so it's important to me that I have an answer to that question. Certainly, it's an excellent source of kinship information concerning your most recent generations. I mean, when you're only going back a few generations, you're learning about people who are very much a part of your genetic structure, very much a part of the, you know, the oral traditions of your family, you know, who you are today. But the further you get back, obviously, I think the way you have to think about it is as an excellent example of what's known as microhistory. Microhistory is a methodology for the study of history that primarily developed on the continent, in Italy and France, and also in Germany in the late 20th century by historians such as Carlo Ginzburg. This is a definition I came up with for this. It's the intensive historical investigation of a well-defined smaller unit of research, often a single individual or event. The method involves examining all types of available primary source evidence and exploring possible interpretations. Outside influences are kept in mind, but the point of view is from the individual or small group being studied. This is exactly what genealogy is. Now, these guys are into microhistory on the continent over the last 30, 40 years or so. They're applying it to all kinds of things, you know, specific events, specific places, specific individuals. But what genealogists do if they're doing their job well is precisely this. So instead of just merely gathering names in every generation going back and gathering marriage records and birth records, the idea is to look at all of the records that you can come up with and create a mosaic about the person to really try to understand the person. Microhistory is different from social history. Social history is more trying to gather information about the mean in a particular place. You know, looking at a bunch of individuals and trying to figure out who the typical individual was. Microhistory is embracing the fact that you're looking at a specific individual and not worrying about the fact that they may be an outlier. You know, just learning everything that you can about them. And the more genealogists who do this, the more data points we get for understanding local history. That's my view anyway. So let me drag this back to the Gilmans and talk about them through that prism. And I want to talk about this one particular line of the Gilmans that came to Exeter back in the 1600s. A lot of times when people are talking about the Gilmans, which of course happens all the time, they don't really know much about the origins of the family. There's some small amount of information about the origins that people know, but for the most part they don't. There's a family tradition that we are descended from a Welsh knight from the 9th century named Gilman Trodu, which is Gilman of the Black Leg. Really, there's no evidence except for the use of the leg here on the Gilman coat of arms, and most Gilman coats of arms in England from really the late Middle Ages going forward into like the 18th century utilize the leg in some portion, in some way. The Norfolk Gilmans, from whom I'm descended, this is their coat of arms. It's pretty much exclusively the leg. I suspect perhaps that they may have been a little insecure, they didn't have any other symbols that they threw on there. But it wasn't really actually until the 18th century, the 1700s, more than 100 years after the Gilmans immigrated to New England, that the Norfolk Gilmans, the same family, rose to the rank of gentry and adopted this coat of arms. So it's not as though this coat of arms goes back into history. This is something that the family adopted when they became gentry in the 1700s. So really, aside from this, we have no evidence of a connection to some Welsh chieftain, and in fact, there's not really a lot of evidence that this Welsh chieftain even ever existed. So possible origins of the Gilmans, it's possibly derived from the old French Gilman, which is a diminutive of Guillaume, or William in English. So after the Norman conquest, of course, William was one of the most popular names, the most popular name for a time, until it was overtaken by the name John. They may be descended from the French. That seems to be when they show up, is shortly after the Norman conquest, but it's hard to say. It's just a guess. What we know for certain is that the Gilmans who came here to New England can trace their lineage back to Norfolk County, England, in the 1500s. Norfolk County is represented by that red area in the east. The records that we have from Norfolk County begin in 1550. There's a marriage record of Edward Gilman and Rose Riss that's dated June 21st, 1550. It's from this church, Holy Cross Church, that still exists in Caston, England. Edward was probably born around 1530, although we really don't know. We're assuming he probably got married when he was 20 or in his early 20s. People wonder, why can't we go back further than that? It's actually going back pretty darn far on an English genealogical line, unless it's a royal line, to get back that far. Henry VIII severed ties with the Catholic Church in 1536, and then ruled that in 1538 that each local parish would have to start maintaining vital records. And actually back at that time, only about 8% of English parishes were doing that, and that caught on throughout the 1500s, so eventually the records get pretty good. But before that, really, the only records that you have that you can rely upon with any degree of certainty are probate records. There are probate records concerning Gilmans. If you see this red dot up here, this is Norfolk County. There was a Geoffrey Gilman there around 1300. And there are several that are unconnected to one another, but that have wills going through the 1300s into the 1400s, 1500s. The last one being Ralph Gilman of Shipton in 1558, which is right around here. Edward Gilman shows up where the X is, as I said, in 1550. Almost certainly Edward was related to some or all of these Gilmans, but we really have no way to connect them, and there really doesn't seem to be any way that will ever emerge. Ralph of Shipton did leave lands and houses in his will in Shipton and Carbrook, which was just like a few miles north of where Edward Gilman shows up in Caston. So it's possible, since he said he left land there to his uncle's children, that Edward was Ralph's cousin or some other relation, but again, we just don't know. So we start with Edward Gilman. This is the origins of the Gilmans of Exeter. The first documentary evidence we have is his will, dated 1573. You can glean quite a bit of information from this one document. It's like a 5-page will. First of all, he identifies himself as a yeoman, which is a class distinction at that time. Someone who identifies himself as a yeoman is a well-off commoner who owned and cultivated his own land. He was a freeman, and he had more land than just the typical freeman, but he wasn't a member of the gentry. As I said, the Norfolk Gilmans didn't rise to that class until a couple hundred years later. Edward's will refers to extensive properties throughout Norfolk County, including houses and lands in Caston, a mansion house and lands in Southgate, and also a bunch of copyhold lands and tenements that he leased out to various parties. So what we know in Elizabethan times is that the Gilmans, well, we're not entirely sure where they come from. They probably have Norfolk origins. Where they came from before that is a mystery, but they were pretty well off by the time of Edward Gilman and Rose Riss. The descent from Edward and Rose, they had 10 children, 6 daughters and 4 sons, most of whom lived, all born between 1550 and 1573. Their 4th child, also named Edward, was born on April 20th, 1557. We don't know his wife, but we know from church records that they had 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons, and their oldest son was also named Edward. We'll call him Edward III. He is the Edward who actually came to New England. Grandson of Edward Gilman and Rose Riss, was born around 1587, married Mary Clark in 1614, and they lived in Hingham, England. This is the church they attended, St. Andros, which is still there. They also had a huge family, 11 children, 4 daughters, and 7 sons. And they were part of the Puritan congregation of the Reverend Robert Peck. He also, Edward III, is listed as a sawyer in some of the Hingham records at that time. So we assume that he ran a mill or mills in that area, although we don't have a lot of records of that. At that time, Norfolk sawmills were wind-powered rather than water-powered. I did want to give a quick aside about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's direct ancestor, Edward Lincoln, also came from Hingham, England, was in the same parish. Edward Lincoln married the sister of Edward Gilman III, named Bridget Gilman, and they also immigrated to Hingham, Massachusetts with the Gilman family at the same time. They were part of the same community. Abraham Lincoln is thus a direct descendant of Edward Gilman of Caston, England. This is a picture of a bust of Lincoln at St. Andrew's Church in Hingham to commemorate Lincoln after his death. It's interesting because Lincoln also visited Exeter many years later, as those of you in the Historical Society know, because his son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was attending Pope's Exeter Academy. I just find that to be a little symmetrical. It's interesting. Reverend Robert Peck, who headed up the congregation that Edward Gilman III was a member of with his family, was Puritan minister in Hingham. He was Cambridge trained, interested in purifying the Church of England. Peck was an extremist even by Puritan standards, which is saying a lot at that time. He was most famous for lowering the chancel railing of the church, which was symbolic of how the Anglican Church had become too removed from its parishioners, but that was a very criminal act at that time. Whoops. He also held private prayer meetings in people's homes, which was strictly forbidden by the Anglican Church. So he ended up getting tried for violating church law. He was convicted and excommunicated from the church. So in 1638, shortly after that, he led a group of 133 Hinghamites, including Edward Gilman, who was at that time 51, to Massachusetts, where they settled in Hingham. I think it's important to note that the religious reasons for these folks leaving and going to Hingham had to play a massive role, because what they decided to undertake, particularly Edward at the age of 51, was to sell everything that he owned, probably at a fraction of its true value, because they moved really quickly. Pack up his family into a small, dangerous boat and travel to Massachusetts, which at that time was not the pleasant place that it is today. It was a very difficult place to live, frankly. So this makes the Hinghamites, including the Gilmans, part of what's called the Great Migration. They sailed to Massachusetts on the Diligent in 1638. He went with his family and also 3 servants. That is not a picture of the Diligent. It is a boat very much like what the Diligent would have looked like. Between 1630 and 1641, approximately 200 ships sailed to Massachusetts carrying approximately 21,000 people. The Great Migration ended in 1640 with the English Civil War, and in fact there was a little bit of a migration back of people who had decided they didn't like living in the wilderness, and perhaps now that the Puritans were in control, they would go back to their mother country. However, those 21,000 immigrants multiplied in the New World at a really rapid rate, and roughly doubling every generation until they reached almost 16 million people today. Still concentrated heavily in the Northeast, but also spread across the country. This is actually a very interesting immigration period because this Great Migration was different from almost every other wave of immigration in American history. It was very homogeneous, comprised almost entirely of English Puritans. They were nearly all from the middle class, which is different from most waves of immigrants who oftentimes come from the lower classes. They nearly all traveled in family groups rather than as individuals. And the family heads tended to be exceptionally literate, highly skilled, and heavily urban. So it was they're going into the wilderness, but these are people who are coming with a tremendous amount of knowledge and a tremendous amount of skills. Also, and this is something a lot of people are aware of, the Great Migration was dominated by people from East Anglia, which is that red region that you see over to the east. It includes Norfolk County and several other counties. In fact, there were people from that region of England comprised fully 60% of the Great Migration immigrants from just that one area. Now, this sometimes gets lost because many historians are well aware of the fact that there were people from virtually every county in England that were part of the Great Migration, but it was heavily concentrated from East Anglia, and even many of the people who came from other counties were either from East Anglia originally or had East Anglia connections. So culturally, the Great Migration is very much from this region of England. At that time, this is another thing people are often unaware of because today East Anglia is more of a rural part of England. Back then, it was densely settled and it was one of the most urbanized parts of the country. In fact, Norwich, which is in Norfolk, was the second largest city in England. So the area was dominated by artisans and skilled craftsmen, and it had larger numbers of freemen than any other county, any other cluster of counties in the country. Other things about East Anglia politically, they had a history of being very rebellious against royal authority. The Peasants' Rebellion of 1381, for example, over poll taxes was concentrated from East Anglia. Almost all the rebellion leaders, including Jack Straw, Wat Tyler, John Ball, and Robert Kett, were from that area. And it was a major center of resistance to Charles I and the Anglican Church after 1625. So this is where some of the most extremist Puritans lived. I raise these points because this theme of resisting royal authority just keeps coming up over and over again after the Gilmans come to New England. And it ultimately culminates in the American Revolution. I sincerely believe that you can trace the seeds of the American Revolution all the way back to East Anglia because New England was dominated by East Anglia. The East Anglia resistance to royal authority was a theme all the way through, right up till the late 18th century, and then New England led the colonies into the Revolution. When the Gilmans got to Massachusetts, they spent most of their first decade in Hingham, Mass., which was founded by the people from Hingham. Edward speculated in land in Seekonk, Mass. I don't think he did very well on that deal. They moved for a time to Ipswich, Mass. in the 1640s. But the connection to Exeter begins in 1647 when Edward's oldest son, Edward IV, then aged 30, entered into this agreement with the inhabitants of Exeter, New Hampshire. That's a copy of the actual agreement, which you can see in the town book still. He was to move to Exeter and set up a sawmill or mills and sell lumber to the inhabitants of Exeter. And he took advantage of the agreement because by 1648 he was running the first sawmill in Exeter on the west side of the Upper Fall near what's now Great Bridge. And within a couple of years he had a second sawmill in operation on the other side of the river. These are the first sawmills in Exeter. There was a grist mill or two before that, but these are the first sawmills. After this, numerous other mill privileges were granted to many other parties. There were pretty much mills at every falls in the greater Exeter area. This is an excerpt of the agreement of the inhabitants of the town of Exeter, and premise that we do accept of Edward Gilman the Younger to be a townsman amongst us, and do give him granted liberty to set up a sawmill or mills in any river or within the liberty of Exeter, and to have the privilege of the river for the use of the mills, and of the pines for sawing, or masts, or any other timber for sawing, to have the privilege of it within the liberty of Exeter. And then just a couple of years later, and this had to be at Edward Gilman's request, it was ordered and voted at town meeting on the 10th of June that there shall not be liberty granted unto any man to set up any sawmill at Exeter Falls upon the town's ground to hinder Edward Gilman of his former grant of his 2 sawmills at the falls, or timber for any other sawmills near said falls. The sawmilling business got very competitive actually in the Exeter area, and as I'll explain a little ways further, there's a reason for that. The lumber, and in particular the masts, were really needed by England. May 10, 1652, shortly after that last record, Mr. Edward Gilman Sr. and his son Moses and Edward Colcord, upon their request to the town, are accepted for inhabitants to come and live amongst us. We can surmise that Edward IV had told his family that it was a pretty fertile undertaking up here in Exeter, and that there was a lot of money to be made in milling. 2 months later, the town granted Edward Sr. and his other sons, John and Moses, his son-in-law, John Levitt, 200 acres of land, those of them that come not to live with us by the next summer, to forfeit their shares again to the town. They, of course, did come, and the rest is early Exeter history. By 1653, Edward's father and brothers had joined him and were building additional sawmills in different locations. There are just, the town records are just riddled with references to these mill interests exchanging hands, and so on. So why did Exeter give such a good deal to the Gilmans? Presumably because they had experience as millers, as the reference back in Kingdom England to Edward III as a sawyer would indicate. But you have to put yourself back in time. When they were here in the early 1600s, this whole area was covered with old growth forest, the type of forest that you now associate more with like the Pacific Northwest. Oaks, birch, maple, but the biggest specimens and the dominant ones were the white pines. These trees grew over 200 feet tall, measured from 1 to 2 yards across at the base, and could go for 80 feet or more without branches until you got up to the canopy at the top. You also have to think about what that meant in terms of like what the area looked like. There were parts that were had been inhabited by the Indians back when the Indian population had been much larger, before the Europeans had shown up in the late 1500s and disease had gone up the coast. But for the most part, the woods you could travel through without really substantial impediment, because there wasn't the same kind of undergrowth that you see in our relatively young forests today. The wood, particularly the pine trees, were perfect for making ship masts. The wood was light, but it was strong. In fact, it was highly competitive with the northern European firs that had been used prior to that, but that had become less available to the English. So the English were eager to find a replacement for those northern European firs. And also, of course, they needed to clear the trees so that they could use the land for agriculture. Lumbering back in the 1600s was extremely difficult work. I'm showing you a photograph of a late 1800s couple of guys, lumbermen, using essentially the same tools that they used in the 17th century. We're talking saws, axes, and wedges. It was really tough work. These are huge trees. I mean, if you consider the concept of going out into the forest and cutting these massive trees down and then hauling them out of the forest. Of course, they hauled them out with large teams of oxen or horses, and they would either have to haul them to the mill, where they would be milled into lumber, or down to the river where they could be floated down to the coast and sold as ship masts. So shortly after Edward IV and John and Moses showed up in 1653, Edward IV sold portions of his interests in his various mills and lands and traveled to England. We presume that it was to obtain mill equipment. There are several records that say he had urgent need to get back to Old England, and he had to raise money. He was raising capital. We know that they had no actual interest in England anymore, so we assume that he was going to get mill equipment. Unfortunately, he died at sea during that trip, and just a little over a year later, Edward III, his father, died. So that left John and Moses in charge of the entire enterprise. Relatively young men, John was 29, Moses was at that time age 25. My ancestor's Moses, I want to tell you a couple of anecdotes about him. There are many, many stories about Moses Gilman that you can get out of the local records in Exeter. He's really a fascinating guy. He came to New England at the age of 8. He married Elizabeth Hershey, a member of the Hershey family of Massachusetts at that time, around 1658. They had a huge family again, 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he was a highly successful businessman in the area. He's also very litigious. The court records are filled with lawsuits that he brought against people or that they brought against him. And many of them over just ridiculous disputes. But he did acquire a lot of property and business interests in the area. Now, his activity, Moses, was in what is presently known as Newfields. On this map, South Newmarket. This is Bell's map of Greater Exeter. Of course, back at that time, Newfields was part of Exeter, as was Epping, Newmarket, Fremont, and Brentwood. It was all part of the Greater Exeter area. Newmarket wasn't set off from Exeter until 1727, which is after Moses' death. And then South Newmarket was set off from Newmarket in 1849, and South Newmarket became Newfields in 1895. But Moses' activity was in Newfields. He had a mill. His major mill was on the Piscassic, off of what's presently called Halls Mill Road. You can actually go down there if you want to stomp out into the woods to the river. You can actually see the old foundations of the first mill that was there. And he had a house that was coming towards Exeter. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But his brother John was the guy who had all the land and business interests in what we think of as downtown Exeter now. I want to talk about some of the types of sources that you can use to get information and what you can learn about these types of ancestors from that information. There's a court case that involved Moses, Thomas Woodbridge versus Gilman in 1678. Woodbridge was a merchant who worked out of Newbury, Mass. Very successful guy. Moses obviously sold him milled lumber, and he purchased from him a variety of imported goods primarily. Some raw materials, things that weren't available around here like sugar, but mostly manufactured goods like clothing, fine textiles, buttons, that kind of thing. Testimony in the case, in addition to listing all the types of things that they were trading, which is kind of interesting in and of itself, tells you a lot about how the lumber business worked back in the 1600s. The lumber was rafted down the waterways to Newbury by people who worked for Moses. And Woodbridge acted as a kind of combination merchant, banker, general store. So Moses would actually give promises to provide lumber to people in exchange for other goods and services. So he might buy, produce from somebody and give them a contract for lumber. And then those people would bring those contracts to merchants like Woodbridge, and he would bundle them together and then demand payment from Moses, of like thousands of feet of merchantable boards. And of course, Moses would then be obligated to provide those boards. So in effect, these early lumber contracts from the early to late 1600s became a form of money in New Hampshire. And it's really kind of fascinating to read, court cases like this. It shows you that the economics of the time are far more complicated than people typically give them credit for. Also, you find records like this. This is a note that Moses penned to his wife, Elizabeth Gilman, obviously asking her to take care of making sure that 12,000 feet of merchantable boards are rafted by Thursday night or sooner. The reason I find this interesting is it shows that his wife had more than a passing interest in this family business. I mean, she obviously was very much involved, even in the 1600s, in what was obviously a very major order. I want to jump ahead a few years and talk about a different anecdote, resistance to Governor Edward Cranfield in the 1680s. New Hampshire originally was granted by royal patent to Captain John Mason and also Ferdinando Gorges in 1622. They, of course, split their land, and Gorges took Maine and Mason took New Hampshire. After the restoration of Charles II to the throne, Mason's grandson, Robert Mason, attempted to reassert this privilege. Basically, the people in New Hampshire had been left on their own for decades, and they had cleared land, they had built up, business interests, agriculture, mills, merchant interests, and built their homes. This grandson wanted to come back and basically assert his claim to a lot of what they had built. And the way Mason did it was by appointing a governor, Edward Cranfield, and then he mortgaged the state to him for 150 pounds per year. So then Cranfield was basically set forth to wreak havoc and raise as much money as he could, to try to pay off the 150 and make as much profit as he could off of it. By 1684, Cranfield had dissolved the legislature and the colonial council, which included Moses' brother, John Gilman, and started levying taxes and collecting rents on his own authority. This was really a big mistake. All of the people of New Hampshire resisted this. They were pretty much opposed to Cranfield. And Constable Thomas Folsom, who was the husband of Moses' sister Mary, refused to collect the taxes for Cranfield. And there's a couple of incidents that happened in December of 1684 and January 1685. Thurton of Hampton attempted to serve a warrant on Folsom for his arrest because he had refused to collect the taxes for Cranfield. What he met with when he got to Exeter was essentially a mob of citizens who gathered and opposed him. At the home of Moses' nephew, Edward Gilman, Folsom told Thurton that if he came to levy execution at his house, he should meet with a red-hot spit and scalding water, and that he did not value any warrant from the governor, council, or justices of the peace, and that the marshal might go like a rogue as he was. There are a lot of stories like this from this period, from Exeter. Thurton and his deputies were basically run out of town, which caused another round of legal reprisals. Early in January, the next month, Thurton arrested Samuel Sherburne for refusing to pay a fine and took him to Henry Roby's house in Exeter. And Moses Gilman and Samuel Levitt visited Roby and Levitt and made remarks against the governor. It got pretty heated. Thurton attempted to arrest Levitt for what he was saying. And according to Roby's deposition, Moses Gilman got really angry. He did suddenly rise up and said that Samuel Levitt should not go to prison. Thereupon he, the said Gilman, did strike the deponent several blows, and also this deponent's son, and caught this deponent by the neckcloth, saying, "Was this deponent a justice of peace, and suffer men to be run through with a sword in his presence? Whereas there was no sword drawn, nor any offered to draw him. And this deponent, to bind the said Levitt from striking the said provost marshal, did endeavor to hold the hand of the said Levitt. But one Samuel Sherburne, being also present, did violently pull this deponent away in order to rescue the said Levitt. This deponent did also make a warrant for committing Moses Gilman, which he delivered to the marshal." So they had kind of a standoff going on in this house until Samuel Sherburne's small son came up and whispered something to Gilman and Levitt, and then they said, "Well, we'll comply." But as they were walking away from the house, when they came near Sherburne's house, they knocked down the guards and ran into the house and bolted the door and refused to come out. Later, at midnight, Moses and a few of his friends showed up at Roby's house and started banging on his door, demanding that he come out so that they could talk to him about the governor. And they claimed that they had a paper that they had set their hand to that essentially said that the governor's rule was completely illegal. And they came back several times. Roby showed the good sense to not let them into the house. And he claims they came back every hour for several hours until it was pretty late in the night, and probably ended at 3 or 4 in the morning. One wonders if perhaps they had made a visit to Moses' tavern they had in town before they went over there. There's no record of a resolution of these charges, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that not much came of it. The governor's role as governor didn't last for very much longer. I just wanted to raise that as an example of what I view as like East Anglian resistance to royal authority. Let me jump ahead from Moses to his son James Gilman. He was born in 1665, married his wife Mary Dolph in 1690. They also had a huge family. He also continued the sawmill business in Newfields. I want to give you guys a little bit of local history that's more tangible. The Gilman PD House. This is built by James Gilman in 1707 on the site supposedly where Moses Gilman had built his first house in the 1650s, which was supposedly burned down by Indians, which is not entirely implausible. There was a lot of engagement with the Indians in the mid to late 1600s. It's a salt box design, which was utilized extensively in East Anglia. Supposedly had features for Indian defense. I have never actually seen those, but supposedly the wall that's on the side where the woods are has a wall of brick in between the wood outside and inside. It also supposedly had a safe room where they could hide it in the event of an Indian attack. It still exists today. It's at 54 Newfields Road. It's about a mile and a half after Swayze Parkway on the left. It's easy to miss because it's kind of set up on the hill and some trees have grown up. But at the time, it was an excellent location. You could see for miles around in every direction from there. It was added to by James' son James and rebuilt by fourth great-grandson Frank Gilman PD in the early 20th century. This is my line, this is James here, this is the line of people who lived in the house. As you can see, it's all Gilmans until you get to Sarah Gilman, and then it's all PDs from there. So you get to Frank Gilman PD, who was born in 1879. This is him. He was a carpenter and contractor in Exeter. He actually did a lot of work on kind of iconic properties in town. He was a contractor for the Iota Theater. He repaired the Congregational Church spire in 1924. He also built the Country Club's new clubhouse in 1926, and had asked for this to be fished out. You can take a look at it afterwards. This is a little hand-drawn map that he made that shows the location of his house. This is Newfields Road. He's asserting that there was a road that went directly up to the Piscassic Mill at that time. There is evidence that there was a road, out in the woods near here. I want to talk about James Gilman for a minute, though, and the mass tree broad arrow policy in New Hampshire. England commenced importation of the North American white pine for use as ship mast in 1652, which, as you'll recall, is right around the time that Moses III joined his son up in Exeter to build sawmills. In the late 1600s, the king began to impose this mass tree policy, reserving all trees with a diameter of 24 inches or more within a foot of the ground for the king. And they were marked with what was known as the king's broad arrow by agents, and they were not supposed to be cut down. That's an example of a broad arrow cut. Obviously, the independent-minded lumbermen of New Hampshire did not appreciate the broad arrow policy, as it essentially took all the best trees and reserved them for the king. But it was difficult to police this because there's a lot of force in New England. You see evidence of charges brought that show that even though it was hard to catch these guys and they're cutting these trees down, that some of them were caught and they were obviously flouting this rule. And this includes James Gilman, who on December 29th, 1701, along with his brothers, were charged by the king's surveyor, Ichabod Plaisted, with cutting mass trees. They confessed, paid a fine. One gets the sense from looking at some of the court records that they just viewed this as a cost of doing business back then. However, a few years after that, Parliament appointed a man named John Bridger to be Surveyor General and to enforce the mass tree policy. He was extremely aggressive and very much hated in New Hampshire. In 1707, just a few years after the charge that I just told you about, he charged James and his brothers again with cutting down mass trees. This is a copy of the actual complaint of Bridger. As you can see, charged with felling and destroying 9 white pine trees, one of which was marked with a broad arrow, and the rest was all about 24 inches in diameter at a foot from the earth, therefore all fit for mass. So he was actually going even beyond the ones that had been marked. If he felt they should have been marked, then you were violating the law. It's interesting that this is a copy of the testimony of the Hiltons and Halls, Richard Hilton, Jonathan Hilton, and Edward Hall, which was relied upon heavily by Bridger. They, of course, owned competing sawmills in Exeter, so one can guess why perhaps they were involved with this. A couple of decades later, an event called the Mass Tree Riot of 1734 happened. Obviously the lumbermen continued to cut down trees. Surveyor General David Dunbar came to do the job of policing the mass trees. He visited a sawmill in Brentwood down near the falls of Pickpocket, and while they were there, inspecting the sawmill and the lumber yard, a bunch of lumbermen sort of circled around them in the woods and fired off muskets until they took off because they were nervous about it. Dunbar came back to Exeter on April 23rd, 1634, and stayed at the public house of Samuel Gilman along with several deputies. While they were sleeping, they were attacked by locals dressed as Indians, beaten up, had their weapons taken, had their sails cut, and they were basically sent out of town. It's a foreshadowing, I think, of the Boston Tea Party, and an interesting story from local history. Finally, I just want to jump ahead to James Gilman from the 1700s. His father, Timothy Gilman, actually died very young when he was in his 20s. I just want to focus on him to give you an example of how you can demonstrate someone's support for the American Revolution using local documents. James was born in 1750 and was married around 1775. Again, had a large family and continued the sawmill business. Now, one would assume that because he was a Gilman that he probably supported the American Revolution, but it can sometimes be more difficult to prove than that. Obviously, there are a number of more famous Gilmans who were strong supporters of the Revolution. There are scores of Gilmans that are listed in the Revolutionary War rolls and on the New Hampshire Association test. And of course, everyone here probably knows about Nicholas Gilman, who was the state treasurer, essentially the governor of New Hampshire in Exeter during the Revolutionary War. His son John Taylor Gilman, who read the Declaration of Independence when he came to New Hampshire. His other son Nicholas Gilman, who was a captain and served on General Washington's staff at Yorktown. But when you're looking at people who are perhaps less well known, like my ancestor James Gilman, he was only 25 years old in 1775. You can find things like this return of Captain James Hill's company at Pierce's Island, which, as you can see, has a James Gilman on it, but how do you know that it's your James Gilman? Well, one way of proving that in New Hampshire using local records is to compare such a roll to the names that appear on the association test. The association test, well, I can just read you this. It was passed by the Continental Congress. In order to carry the unwritten resolve of the Honorable Continental Congress in execution, you are requested to desire all males above 20 years of age, lunatics, idiots, and Negroes excepted, to sign the declaration on this paper, and when so done, to make return thereof, together the name or names of all who should refuse to sign the same to the General Assembly or Committee of Safety of this colony. In New York, they were pretty zealous about ensuring that they either got your signature or put your name on the list at the bottom of the association test for your town. This is the test itself. We, the subscribers, do hereby solemnly engage and promise that we will, to the utmost of our powers, at the risk of our lives and fortunes, with arms, oppose the hostile proceedings of the British fleets and armies against the United American colonies. Sort of an 18th century version of, I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of the British Empire. So if we go back to this return of James Hill's company, you can see that Gilman is listed there. 27 out of the other 40 names on this roll also appear on the Newmarket Association test as supporting the Revolution. And in fact, there's another 8 individuals who have surnames that are Newmarket surnames. We could probably assume that some of these other guys were young fellows, since it was only people who were over the age of 20 that would sign. So that's pretty strong evidence that this was, a company that was mustered out of Newmarket. And in fact, we have further confirmation of James' Revolutionary War service because his grandson, also named James, was interviewed for a local county history in the mid-1800s. James' father, David Gilman, had died when James the Younger was a very young boy, and he was taken into his grandfather James' home, so he had extensive first-hand experience with him. And he stated during his interview that his grandfather, James, had served in the Continental Army for a few months at Portsmouth, which also corresponds with the Pierce's Island role. So anyway, this James ultimately left and moved to Meredith, New Hampshire in 1789, becoming the first of our branch to leave the Exeter area. And that's pretty much all I have. I just sum up on the Gilmans, just from the anecdotes that I've given you this evening. They're descendants of strong-willed Puritans from East Anglia, independent-minded businessmen, resistant to overreach by monarchy, and ultimately strong supporters of the American Revolution. There are countless other facts that you can develop about individuals by looking at extant local records. I mean, it's really almost like bought on as well, particularly in New England. Does anyone have any questions? Or have they lulled you into it?
What was the suit about Woodbridge versus Moses Gilman?
As best as I can tell, because it's not a complete record, Woodbridge was accusing Moses of failing to deliver the boards. So all the evidence, or failing to deliver all the boards. So all the evidence it goes to when the boards were delivered and who delivered the boards, and there's lots of testimony from various workmen, as well as evidence of what items had been purchased by Moses and how much he owed, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, though, there's no conclusion. It's, the papers are all in a file, and there's no conclusion to the case, so we really don't know. I assume that Moses must have won.
Thank you.
Is the Levitt you refer to there, the family that had a place close by?
Right near where you live, yes. Yeah, in fact, Moses Levitt, who's the father of that Hannah Levitt, has a gravestone in the woods behind Richard Harmon's house.
Right, there's a whole...
Yeah, Moses was the big guy. He was the progenitor in Exeter. Yes, sir?
Was it 1750 that they enjoined those millers from treading on the Gilman sawmills? Was it 1750?
It was 1650.
1650.
Yeah.
That was Edward III?
That was Edward IV.
Edward IV. Was his wife a selectman?
She was not. Although Moses was a selectman for a number of years.
I have another question, a serious question. The mass that they saw, there were mass roads all over the place, all over New England.
Right.
What was the supply and demand? Was it, it seems like there must have been thousands and thousands.
The demand was massive. I mean,
How many
basically New England and Canada were providing almost all the mass for the English fleet for decades.
How large was the fleet? Was it just?
It was huge. And mass had to be replaced as well. And then you also have commercial shipping, so it was just huge demand.
It wasn't just the main masts on ships either, it was the spars that were involved, where you'd have dozens on one ship that you needed to make out of one piece of wood. So a lot of the mast trees, and when they talk about mast building and everything, they're talking about all of the woodwork above deck on the ship.
Thank you.
There is local evidence that the Gilmans did not follow the broad arrow policy in our old house on Cass Street, John Gilman House. There's a single board that's 32 inches wide upstairs in the major problem.
I'm sure that it was acquired.
28 inches down below. The house is plastered with these huge boards that are declaring that we do not follow the governor's policy.
Nice. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I know that you had to give up the opportunity to see Marco Rubio, and you're not going to know until you leave here whether, in fact, he saw his shadow, which means that he will continue in the primaries well past South Carolina.